I'm here again, reviewing another book. I'm deep in the reads, by the way, but the book's more important. The book is called Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America by Marcia Chatelain. Marcia Chatelain is the professor of history and African studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. This is her second and most recent book, and it's the winner of a Pulitzer Prize. It won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2021. The book is an exploration of the complex relationship between fast food chains, especially McDonald's, and black culture. So you might expect a book like this to be an unequivocal criticism of that relationship and talking about fast food as being predatory on nutritional literacy or vulnerable communities or what have you. And while it is that, it's not that straightforward. Marcia Chatelain takes a sort of pros versus cons approach in looking at the multifaceted ways that fast food and McDonald's interact with black culture and black communities. The first few chapters of Franchise start off by giving you a brief overview of the early history of McDonald's, starting from the McDonald's brothers having their restaurant idea stolen from under them by Ray Kroc, to how McDonald's would eventually expand away from just marketing to white middle-class suburbanites and target inner-city demographics, which were much more broader. She also does a good job in contextualizing the cultural moment that McDonald's was able to capitalize on in order to become so popular, talking about the expansion of the middle class, how roads and highways were really connecting in the United States, and how a lot of people were able to afford cars, and there was a big drive-in culture. But we're running counter to that. She also explains that black people were largely locked out of this boom in opportunity from the post-war rise of the middle class. So she goes from that and she kind of weaves it together by talking about how a combination of franchise capitalism and civil rights and a need to placate black communities after the assassination of Martin Luther King led to McDonald's and other fast food chains marketing themselves heavily to communities of color. She explores the relationship between communities of color and McDonald's from various angles, from the way that McDonald's advertised to black people to the way that, run-ins with black power organizations like the Black Panthers. And she also introduces a lot of concepts like black capitalism and the sort of conflicts that happened within civil rights movements for people that felt that they didn't quite want to play into the status quo or be commodified or have their movement co-opted. While I may not relate to some of the issues raised in this book on a personal level in the way that some others might, I still found the issue of black capitalism to be the most interesting to read about. Chatelain describes how after Martin Luther King was assassinated, the civil rights movement fractured, with some going towards black power groups like the Black Panthers, which I covered in my review of Black Against Empire, while others were much more interested in going corporate and going mainstream because they believed that entering the workforce and getting into this franchise capitalism would be a good way of enriching their communities and themselves, and that economic stabilization would be the way forward for racial equality. But Marcia Chatelain sort of characterizes the support for black capitalism as being mostly cynical. She talks about how even right-wing politicians and a lot of the status quo power structure was in support of black capitalism. And while many might be tempted to say, okay, well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe it's just them being beneficent. She talks about it as being a lot more about sort of evading responsibility and putting the onus for economic disparity back onto the communities that were adversely affected by racial discrimination and systemic racism. So it has this kind of way of sidestepping the issue, and while she's critical of it for that reason, she also doesn't hesitate to say that a lot of good has come out of black capitalism. For example, she talks about how a lot of black franchisees and other franchisees of color have had good effect on their communities. So Chatelain often is critical of the relationship between Black America and McDonald's and other fast food chains, but she is also willing to talk about the silver linings that have come out of it as well. As franchise goes on, you realize that a subject matter which seemed fairly niche and at first is actually quite broad, and you start to wonder how Chatelain's going to be able to pull all of these moving pieces together and make a cohesive book out of it. And the problem for me comes from the fact that she often seems to not know how to prioritize the good bits and summarize the bits that are more tangential. She often buries the lead, making a lot of her writing come across as sort of tedious because she seems to be following every single tangent and like exploring it to a point that's a little unnecessary, while at the same time ignoring a lot of the more important topics. For example, at one point in the book, McDonald'S is kind of warily watching these discrimination cases unfold against these beer companies, and they start to question their own equitable hiring practices as a result. So Chatelain could have summed up the beer companies in a few sentences, but instead she spends a few pages on them. And for other topics, like for example, the racial disparity in health in neighborhoods of color and how fast food plays into that, you assume that she's going to go into some great detail on that because it's something that a lot of people have pointed out. Instead, she only talks about it for 2 pages right at the end of the book, and the dust jacket makes it seem as if she's going to spend more time on it, so it's a little bit, I don't know, weird that she wouldn't do that because it's obviously an issue. And other things like food deserts and food activism, she literally mentions just in passing. She doesn't even define what they are. So a lot of the time you'll be reading the book and something will come up where you think she's going to like go for it, but instead she'll get sidetracked by a tangent. It really does seem like she's trying to pull every piece of research she can into the book, even though not all of them fit to create a cohesive narrative. And that really comes to a fore in the conclusion. Normally in conclusions, what you want to do is summarize the book that you've laid out and wrap it all up into a nice thesis. But for the conclusion in this book, she's introducing you to subjects that haven't been mentioned anywhere else in the book before. So the result is that the thesis feels disjointed from what you've been reading. So I think it's a shame because this topic really interested me, especially when I saw that it had won a Pulitzer. So to see that there's a lot of missed opportunities is kind of unfortunate, and it left me kind of having mixed feelings on the book. So on one hand, I think that Franchise is worth a read if you're more interested in the niche subjects of this book, like the social aspects of fast food and like big corporations. But if you're looking for something that deals with the more broad aspects of this book, like black capitalism or the way that social and progressive movements are often co-opted and denuded by the system, I have to imagine that there are better books out there that suit that category. And if you know of any, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about those. So yeah, at the end of the day, this gets a 6 out of 10 for me. It's still a decent read, but it just comes with a few caveats. Yeah. So that's my review. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.